Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Atlantic Council think tank in Washington, D.C., where we're meeting with Jorge Benitez, who is the editor of the NATO Source blog, one of the top sources of information for folks who are interested in following the Atlantic Alliance. Jorge, thanks very much for meeting with us. Obviously, NATO nations were concerned with some of the rhetoric that was coming out of Donald Trump when he was a candidate, questions about reducing America's role or means testing America's response to its allied commitments. Since he became president, obviously some talk still from the president about the NATO being an obsolete alliance and the importance of allies spending more money. Every American president since Eisenhower has been telling European nations to spend more money on their defense. But tell us a little bit about Jim Mattis's visit there. Jim Mattis, obviously a highly decorated military leader, was the Supreme Allied Commander of Transformation, one of NATO's most important commands here in the United States. That job was broken up when Bob Gates, Secretary Gates, decided to sunset JIFCOM, Joint Forces Command, and then SACT went became a French general officer billet. What are some of the messages that Jim Mattis has taken to Europe for his first meetings in Brussels, and has that done anything to calm NATO, America's European allies in NATO?
Thank you, Vago. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. I think this is a very important meeting for Secretary Mattis and for NATO itself. This is his first opportunity to talk to such a senior level person in the Trump administration and to hear firsthand what is going to be the NATO policy of this new administration. I think Secretary Mattis did a very good job of saying the right things, sending a very positive message to our NATO allies. He made a very direct effort to try to reassure them to say, and he used the word ironclad, that this administration has an ironclad and that NATO is a bedrock of our security. The key question, though, is, and while the allies really received that positively, in the back of their minds, they're also wondering, they're glad that Jim Mattis is saying this, they're glad to hear this from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, but is this what the President of the United States feels? A lot of people have spoken about what Trump feels about NATO. President Obama talked about what Trump said about NATO. Secretary General Stoltenberg has said about what Trump has said on NATO, but it's the words that Trump himself has said about NATO that raises doubts in our allies' minds, and they want to hear from the President himself. What is Trump going to say about NATO? And they're going to find out about it on May 25th at the next NATO summit.
What are, as I mentioned, so many American presidents have tried to pressure their NATO allies to spend more money. Part of the Wales summit was to increase that goal of 2% of GDP, have 20% dedicated to real capabilities. Britain has been one of the countries most proud that it's hitting both of those marks, one of the few members of the alliance to do so. Mattis went over and delivered that message again. Bob Gates delivered that message a few years ago that, if NATO nations don't pony up more money for their own security, that America may have to, in the future, moderate its commitment to the alliance. Those are words that Mattis used. What impact do those words have on the alliance?
Those are very strong words because it shows that this isn't just rhetoric. This isn't just talk from a new administration. A lot of, as you said, historically, every administration has tried to urge and encourage the Europeans to spend more on their defense, but there hasn't been any what to this. Now there is an or what. If the Europeans do not increase their defense spending, Mattis specifically asked them to come up with plans and milestones by the end of this year, so he's given them a deadline. They want to see some movement from the Europeans. And in response, he says, if they don't, then it seems like this administration is going to moderate its commitment. They haven't been provided details of what moderated commitments means, but the fear is, by some of the Europeans, is they're going to go back to the language that Trump used during the campaign, which means it might mean moderating our commitment to Article 5. I don't think that's what Mattis has in mind. I think we may moderate some of our troops that we contribute to Europe, some of the forces that we send over there, but I don't think it's going to moderate our overall commitment to NATO. But the real question is, how will our allies interpret this? And then the even more dangerous one is, how does Moscow interpret it? When it sees the Secretary of Defense of the United States saying that there's a moderated commitment of the U.S. to NATO, is that a provocation? Is that an opening for them to probe NATO and to see if the U.S. will really back up Article 5? And that's a very dangerous situation.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting choice of words. It was an interesting choice of words when Gates used it, and Gates did get criticized in some quarters, right? It was an important message to deliver so that the NATO allies do spend more money. They have been underinvesting. I mean, just over the border, one of our closest allies, Canada, underspends on defense on a chronic basis, which annoys some Europeans, by the way. They're like, one of the biggest offenders is actually shares the longest unprotected border with you guys. But what does from the standpoint of moderating, changing troop presence, you could argue, would undermine the United States, would undermine America's interest to reduce troop presence. There are some countries that have been looking at that. Are there any signs at all that the United States might reduce its commitment, as some nations, particularly in the Baltics and on the eastern border of the alliance, fear?
Well, the United States has already moderated to some extent. You've already seen this in previous administrations. In the Obama administration, we had the concept of leading from behind. There was already that pressure of let the Europeans handle the security concerns in their own neighborhood, and then we would provide the enablers. We would support them and help them, but let them carry the main share of the security load in their own territories. What you're seeing now in the Trump administration is actually the continuation of that. But the main question is, to what degree? Will it only be to some degree? The big difference is that for the first time, this seems to be a first direct attempt by a U.S. administration to raise the cost for the Europeans if they don't cooperate, if they don't fulfill their obligations. We should also keep in mind that this isn't the U.S. asking the Europeans to do something new. This is something we've been asking them for a while. This is something they've already agreed upon for years that they were going to do. They're not fulfilling their commitments. They're not agreeing what they said they were going to do. And at the bottom line is, the United States is only be doing what the Europeans are doing by themselves. They've reduced their commitments unilaterally. They've dropped out of not fulfilling their burdens. And so what they're getting enhanced is they're getting a U.S. administration that is starting to act more like a European power than a traditional U.S.
Each one of America's European allies, even though everybody agreed to the Wales summit goals, and Warsaw Summit reinforced those, and there was also naming and shaming, where now the alliance is actually printing how much money everybody is spending, both from a top-line perspective, but also on a capabilities perspective. And that was a very, very specific thing at Wales, after Wales, to make that very clear, to have those numbers easily findable. Each one of the nations, the leading nations, have a series of different challenges. The UK, obviously one of the defense leaders of Europe and the alliance, is facing Brexit, which could have some negative economic consequences. In fact, we've seen a drop in the value of the pound that creates certain financial challenges, which London has hedged for the time being. If you look at France, France is looking at domestic counter-terror operations while it still tries to maintain its overseas commitments, continue pressure in the fight against ISIS as well as elsewhere. Netherlands, each one of these countries have challenges in terms of their own internal challenges that they're facing with. Norway, even one of the wealthier countries, has an immigrant challenge and a migrants challenge. How many of these nations are going to be able to deliver on these goals ultimately by the end of the year?
Well, the political reality is that not even half of the NATO members will be able to achieve this goal by the end of this year or even by the end of next year. The 2% raise GDP target is a very far step. About 7 of the NATO members are closer to 1% or halfway there than they are to the 2%. Most of them are around 1.5%. But we're still talking about billions and billions of dollars for them to increase. But so politically, this is very challenging and unlikely for them to do it because it will take time as democracies to build the kind of support to do this. But economically, I think they have full capacity now. It's just a question of political will. The thing is that they have reduced their threat perception. They have not caught up to the real security environment, to the danger of the fact that there's a major power in Europe that in the last 9 years has invaded 2 of its neighbors and continues to be provocative, that is interfering in the domestic elections of several NATO members, including the United States, including the French election that's taken up soon. And yet they still want to spend as if it was 1992 and there was no Warsaw Pact, no Soviet Union, there's no threat in Europe. Something has to change, but the capability is there. So for example, during the Cold War, we had the Dutch government was able to deploy a full division to West Germany and keep it equipped. These days, the Dutch government can't even provide a battalion for the Baltic republics. So it's a question of will. Even though the Dutch economy is much greater and stronger and larger now, it's just there's an unwillingness to spend these things on defense rather than on domestic issues.
Do you think that Germany obviously is one of the largest countries? Germany has said that it's going to spend more money on its defense, but is still one of the weakest, certainly for a major power in Europe. What's the economic future? What's the German defense future look like?
I think the German defense future is going to be more of the same. I think they're still making only incremental changes. I think the fact that they're increasing their defense budget is a good PR move for them, but I think it's not nearly at the level that it needs to be, not just for the NATO standards, but also for their own readiness. In the last 2 years, they've had some major scandals within the Bundeswehr that they just don't have their equipment prepared. They don't have air transports that can fly. They don't have ships that can sail. They've had a major maintenance problem, and I think even with the defense increases aren't enough to even take care of that readiness problem, let alone to fulfill their NATO commitments.
Let me take you to the question of the potential dissolution of the EU. For many, I was just talking to an American friend of mine. He's of Dutch heritage. Was just in Netherlands not very long ago for the holidays. And one of the things that he was talking about was, this sort of anti-EU trend. It looks like Wilders is in the lead, likely to win. He's made it very clear that he's not very keen on the EU. Marine Le Pen has said the same thing in France. And there are other parties who are looking at the same sort of thing. I mean, you mentioned also Russian support. There were those who say that there was quite a lot of Russian support for UKIP and Britain's departure from the EU. And you've seen Russian money going into a lot of other places. It's actually a two-part question. Part one of the question is, what are the implications on NATO if there's a dissolution of the EU? Sandy Vershbow has been one of the, Ambassador Vershbow has been one of the people who said, look, it's not going to be good for NATO to see the EU collapse. What are the potential implications of a further dissolution of the EU and its implications on the Atlantic lines?
Well, I recognize that there are many shortcomings in the EU and there are many things that the EU could be doing better. Overall, the EU serves the interest of the European public and it serves the national security interest of the United States. That's why the United States has supported the common integration of Europe since the end of World War II. We have been one of the initiators of it because we believe that cooperation among the Europeans is good. We want a cooperative security environment in Europe, not a competitive one like the Russians do. But having said that, I think the dissolution of the EU would be a huge geostrategic blow. Because while NATO is the military, political side of the alliance, that the EU is really the economic and diplomatic side that helps create a cooperative security environment in Europe. And without that, it would be really helpful for our adversaries and really weaken our power.
Throughout the campaign, but even until very recently, the President Trump has talked about a much warmer relationship with Russia, the importance to have a good relationship with Russia. Obviously, there have been a lot of opponents to that, so there's been a sort of a bifurcated rhetoric. Some of the talk that we've heard from Secretary Mattis was very tough. We've heard some very tough things from Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, as well as from Rex Tillerson, and certainly from John McCain and Lindsey Graham and some other Republicans up on the Hill who are very, very uncomfortable with talk, for example, about getting any closer to Russia, and certainly dropping of any sanctions against Russia. That seems to have been tamped down at this point. What would the repercussions be of the United States moving? Again, it's not likely, looking less likely, but what would have the repercussions been for the United States to move to drop sanctions, for example, on Russia over Ukraine?
I think while that step hasn't been taken so far, I think there's still a lot of concern both within the U.S. Congress and in NATO capitals that the Trump administration might make a unilateral move like that. Trump's views on Russia is the most important security question for this administration. It's the way he defines his relationship with Putin will have tremendous impact on NATO and European security. He has been very reluctant to say anything negative about Putin, even when asked about things such as the violence that's going on in Ukraine and his own oppression of his people at home. So that's very curious. While Trump, during the campaign and even now as president, he has sort of been described positively as very malleable in his foreign policy, has changed his views and his description on several issues. His views on Russia has been the one thing he has been most consistent about. So it's important to see how he's going to fill in the details and what is going to be his actual policy with Russia.
I was talking to some European friends of mine, and one of the concerns they had was about Steve Bannon, and their view was, look, in the White House is a guy who's supporting these right-wing movements, right? And Mr. Bannon has been very, very clear about support for Le Pen and other movements that would seek to, change the European order. What sort of a message does that send? And does that actually become one of the most important issues that Europeans will be focusing on over the next few months, not the reassurances, for example, that the Defense Secretary may be giving them?
I think that there is a lot of concern, both domestically and internationally, about the role of Steve Bannon, particularly about the fact that he was made such a statutory member of the NSC, given such a prominent role. And the question is not just in terms of how he will influence in his support for certain views, but the fact that he seems to be playing such an influential role in foreign policy overall. He's included in all of these meetings and all of these phone calls with these heads of state. He's been one of the chief drivers and drafters of all the executive orders that the Trump administration has been putting out. He's played a much more prominent role in Trump's foreign policy than his cabinet officials, more so than Mattis, more so than Tillerson. So people really are concerned as to see what was his role and whether there are different factions or centers of power and influence within this Trump administration, and which one is going to be dominant over the long term.
What are some unintended consequences? You know, you may do things for the best reasons. You may be pressuring your European allies to spend more money, ultimately for the best reasons. But things like that also can backfire. Each one of these are sovereign countries. They have their own interests. They have their own political, domestic concerns and challenges. If you look at it from a German standpoint, Germany can easily argue, look, I mean, we've absorbed so many refugees that we're going to have to direct resources as a national priority to address that challenge, short of starting to ship people out of their countries. And that's the case for many nations that took in quite a lot of refugees over the past year or two. You know, what are some of the unintended potential consequences of putting pressure on European governments to spend more money?
The consequences can be huge because if we are penny wise but pound foolish, we may try to gain a tactical advantage on certain small things, on certain specific issues, but we may poison the relationship with our allies. And our allies and the alliance system that we have benefits us more than any other power in the world. We have to remember that when we went to Afghanistan to fight terrorism, to attack the people that launched the 9/11 attack, the Europeans sent 40,000 troops to help us fight. No other country in the world has allies that will send 40,000 troops to help defend them. Russia doesn't have it. China doesn't have it. Iran doesn't have it. These are important relationships that are much more valuable to U.S. national security than any one specific negotiation. And that's what I think is important for the president to understand, that just winning certain negotiated deals is not as important as the overall thing, because the beauty of the overall thing, the truth of the matter is, with our democratic allies, we are making the rules for the international system. The world plays by our rules, that the ones that are set by us and the democracies in Europe. And together, these rules benefit us more than anybody else. And that's why there are revisionist powers. And there are revisionist great powers and revisionist non-actors, because they want to change the rules. They want to change the rules so that they can oppress their own people, so that they can invade their neighbors, so that they can persecute the religious minorities, so that they can behead their ethnic minorities, and they want to create a new rule system. But I think this rule system benefits us and is worth preserving.
If the United States decides not to lead or to take a backseat, as President Trump said in his inaugural address, he made that very, very clear, that it's time to focus at home. It is a continuation a little bit of some of the rhetoric you heard from President Obama. Do you think, although not nearly as much, right? President Obama did used to talk still about the United States being the indispensable nation. If the United States doesn't lead in a NATO context and a European context, who will step up to lead?
Unfortunately, the most likely candidates are all the bad guys. Most of the other democracies and our allies are overburdened and don't have the capabilities. There's not going to be a Germany that's going to take the lead. There's not going to be a France that takes the lead. But you very much see an authoritarian Russia, an authoritarian China, a radical Iran. They all want to take the lead. They want to create a world system that the rules benefit them and their kind of totalitarian systems.
Last question. Obviously, the president has repeatedly talked about NATO being obsolete. From your standpoint, as somebody who watches it at a think tank that was born to advance the Atlantic Alliance, right, in the spirit of full disclosure, is NATO obsolete?
Absolutely not. I think we need NATO now more than ever, at a time when there is a great power trying to acquire more territory and to bully and to use violence against its neighbors in Europe, at a time when there is terrorism all across the Mediterranean, where there is instability and violence all across NATO's southern flank. We need NATO now more than ever. We need to protect these allies because they're protecting us. And doing so, we protect what we call our democratic values, these transatlantic values that have been such a boon for us. That's why the United States has been at peace and prosperous since World War II, because we've had these allies on our side rather than on our adversaries.
But the president's answer to that would be that the alliance should be much, much more focused on counterterrorism. Would that be a mistake?
I think it's a question of the president becoming more educated about what NATO has been doing on terrorism and what NATO is still willing to do. Just this week, NATO announced that it's setting up a counterterrorism hub in Italy to help deal it more effectively with counterterrorism from the Mediterranean. NATO is increasing its intelligence sharing. All of the NATO members are contributing to the anti-ISIS coalition in Syria and Iraq. So NATO is doing quite a bit and willing to do more. I think if he sees leadership and sees NATO as a valuable resource, he can get more help from our allies. But if he tries to deal with it negatively, he's going to ruin that relationship for us.
Would tailoring the alliance to become more of a counterterrorism force undermine its deterrent capacity against nations like Russia?
I don't think so, because Russia is also using hybrid warfare, and it's using unconventional means against the West. I think these are the tools that can be used both from the threats from the East and the threats from the South. NATO's been able to walk and chew gum for many decades, and it succeeded and was able to overcome the Warsaw Pact, because it may not be pretty, it may not be fast, but the democracies working together, it creates deterrence, it creates strength, and that keeps the bad guys away.
George, thanks very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Vago. Thank you.